The British were planning a cruel tragedy in Ukraine during the G20 summit. Power outages in Ukrainian homes are the result of the shelling of military infrastructure. The ruling on the MH17 Downing case is about a non-international armed conflict in Ukraine. Find out about these and other Russian propaganda fakes in today's episode. Detector Media did all the dirty fact-checking work for you. We have separated real facts from those of a parallel universe. My name is Vadym Miskyi. In the next 10 minutes, I will tell you about the most impressive examples of Kremlin propaganda, as well as about some international media that use unverified sources of information. Here we go. The British were preparing a cruel tragedy in Ukraine during the G20 summit. This fake was spread by pro-Russian Telegram channels. They claim that they were plotting a catastrophe in Ukraine before the G20 summit to increase the attention of all participants to Ukrainian crisis. This plan was to be implemented by the British. When propagandists warn about something tragic, it is typically a Russian evil plan. In this case, the Kremlin is working proactively to shift the blame for its actions. Here is the proof. Russia launched a massive missile attack on Ukraine during the G20 summit. The Kremlin launched more than 90 cruise missiles and more than a dozen strike drones. This attack was one of the heaviest since the beginning of the full-scale war. Here is what the British Prime Minister had to say about the Kremlin's action. According to the Kremlin propagandists, he was probably supposed to have planned the provocation.
On the very day that I and others confronted the Russian foreign minister across the G20 summit table with the brutality of his country's actions. On the very day that President Zelensky addressed the G20 with a plan to stop the war, Russia launched over 80 separate missile strikes on Ukraine. The targets were innocent people and civilian infrastructure. The aim, to cast the population into darkness and cold. Once again, Russia has shown its barbarity and given the lie to any claim that they are interested in peace.
The head of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, Dmytro Kuleba, tweeted that the civilized West should take the side of civilians, not war criminals who launch missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. Power outages in Ukrainian homes are the result of the shelling of military infrastructure. This manipulative information was spread by Russian propagandists. Russia supposedly launches attacks only on military infrastructure, which leads to power outages in residential buildings. However, this is a distortion of facts. Russia is shelling the energy infrastructure of Ukraine to leave Ukrainians without light and heat in winter. This has been confirmed by the Pentagon.
The deliberate targeting of the civilian power grid, causing excessive collateral damage and unnecessary suffering on the civilian population, is a war crime. With the onset of winter, families will be without power and, more importantly, without heat. Basic human survival and subsistence is going to be severely impacted, and human suffering for the Ukrainian population is going to increase. These strikes will undoubtedly hinder Ukraine's ability to care for the sick and the elderly. Their hospitals will be partially operational. The elderly are going to be exposed to the elements. In the wake of unrelenting Russian aggression and incalculable human suffering, Ukraine will continue to endure. Ukraine is not going to back down. The Ukrainian people are hard, they're tough, and most of all, they're free, and they want to remain free.
The shelling of civilian infrastructure was only a reason for the Western countries to increase military assistance to Ukraine.
Now, we were meeting today as Russia continues to target Ukraine's civilians and bombard its energy grid. But Russia's deliberate cruelty only deepens our resolve. And we'll continue to support Ukraine's bedrock right to defend itself and defend the rules-based international order. I'm pleased to be able to report that the NASAMS air defense systems that we've sent to Ukraine are now operational. and their performance so far has been very impressive. The NASAM systems had a 100% success rate in intercepting Russian missiles as the Kremlin continues its ruthless bombardment of Ukraine, including yesterday's attacks. We're also working to secure more critical equipment to protect and repair Ukraine's energy infrastructure after Russia's indefensible attacks.
The goal of propagandists is simple: to increase panic and fear among Ukrainians. But it is impossible. Kyiv will not be persuaded to negotiate in this manner. The Ukrainian government has repeatedly emphasized that moving to the stage of diplomatic negotiation is possible only if Russian troops withdraw beyond the 1991 borders. Non-international conflict. This is how the court in The Hague supposedly described the events of 2014 in eastern Ukraine. This fake is spread by Russian media. They claim that when announcing the verdict on the downing of MH17, the judge said that it was a non-international armed conflict in Ukraine. This is not true. In fact, the judge of the International Court said that in April 2014, Ukrainian troops fought against separatist groups controlled by Russia. The judge also noted that the defendants do not have the right to enjoy immunity granted to soldiers of the warring parties, as representatives of separatist groups are not Russian army soldiers. The Hague Court found Russian citizens Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Ukrainian citizen Leonid Kharchenko guilty of the downing of flight MH17 and the death of 298 people.
Girkin, Dubinsky en Kharchenko worden veroordeeld. En de rechtbank kwalificeert de bewezen verklaarde feiten in hun zaken als de eendaagse samenloop van het medeplegen van een luchtvaartuig opzettelijk en wederrechtelijk doen verongelukken, terwijl daarvan levensgevaar voor een ander te duchten was en het feit iemands dood ten gevolge heeft. En het medeplegen van moord, meermalen, namelijk 298 keer gepleegd.
President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that a strong foundation for long-term peace will be when all murderers and torturers are convicted and their commanders and political backers receive their fair sentences.
Але це рішення не просто про 3 вбивць. Росія багато брехала про цю катастрофу, але все одно ключові факти були встановлені. Зараз засуджені виконавці і забезпечена основа, щоб засудити винних і вищого рівня. Тих, хто несе повну особисту відповідальність за злочин агресії проти України. Первісний злочин, який породив усі інші скоєні рашистами від 2014 року.
The trial was held in absentia. They are on the international wanted list. Girkin, Dubinsky, and Kharchenko were sentenced to life imprisonment. The US wants to continue the war in Ukraine to benefit from the constant sale of weapons. This fake is spread by Kremlin propagandists. They say that American companies make huge profits, which is why US officials insist on continuing the war. However, this is not true. EU versus Disinfo experts with reference to the Washington Post reported on Ukraine's invitation to the negotiation table. The initiator is the United States. The reason is the reduction of Washington's military arsenal. In other words, the US has no intention to continue the war by supplying even more weapons.
Well, I'd say up front that in a lot of ways, Ukraine will drive the prioritization in terms of what's most important to them. They're the ones that are on the battlefield, and they're the ones that continue to press the attack in terms of their counteroffensive. And so certainly, as evidenced today by Russia's airstrikes, missile strikes against civilian targets in places like Kyiv, air defense continues to remain a priority, and we'll continue to work with Ukraine on how we can best support them from an air defense standpoint.
At the same time, Western officials give a clear answer to whether Zelensky should join the negotiating table, and at the same time, whether Russia is ready for such negotiations.
You'll have to ask Mr. Zelensky that, and I think he's been very clear, including his visit to Kherson yesterday, that they continue to want to get back their own territory and to restore their sovereignty. Only Mr. Zelensky can determine if and when he's ready to negotiate. What we've said is we're going to make sure that his military can continue to succeed on the battlefield until such time as Mr. Zelensky is ready to sit down and negotiate. And I would add that if you just look at what's going on, Mr. Putin clearly has no indication or no inclination to sit down and negotiate. And quite the contrary. You know, he's buying drones from Iran. He's establishing martial law in these so-called annexed territories, which obviously they don't belong to Russia. Everything he's doing says he's doubling down in terms of trying to extend this conflict.
Thus, propagandists are spreading a fake about the US interest in continuing the war to damage the credibility of the West, which, as they say, is helping Ukraine only for its own sake. The Kremlin media, as we can see, think like their leader. In Putin's worldview, it is impossible even to imagine that the leaders of civilized countries are ready to suffer a drop in their ratings, to bear financial losses, to achieve what we dream of in Ukraine. Peace. Have a good day.